Hi, I'm Dio Kurazawa, one of the founding partners of the Bear Scouts, and we're here on a panel to discuss Elegance is Refusal. It's a quote by Coco Chanel. We can draw many conclusions from this quote, but you know, based on today, however, considering the inequalities, vast inequalities that exist in the capitalist society that we live in, I find this refusal to be an appropriate stance against a system that fosters these insecurities. This is therefore a refusal to accept industry or a system that depends on the insecurities and inequality to achieve profits to maintain economic growth. How would Coco Chanel feel about the industry today? Would she be appalled by the vast inequalities that exist between those who sell our garments and those who make them? Please join me in welcoming Michael BEUTLER, Emma Bushi, and Ursula de Castro as we discuss this topic. Guys, before we start, can you please introduce yourself? Let's start with Emma.
Hey, nice to meet everyone. I'm Emma Broski. I'm a fashion designer, just recently graduated from Geneva Art School. And I recently participated to the fashion festival, Festival de Hier, and I had the chance to win the Chanel Mode Prize and the Mercedes-Benz Prize. So in my practice, I like to inspire myself of agriculture and of the rural areas, domestic know-how, and now I try also to bring old craft back and to transmit all my know-how.
Very nice. And Michael.
So hi, I'm Michael BEUTLER. I am the Sustainability Operations Director at KERING Group. I've been there actually for quite a while now and sort of seen the transition of the industry. I'll say from an industry where people didn't really think about where clothing was from and how it was made to an industry now where transparency and accountability is becoming, I'll say, the watchword of the day in sustainability. And you're really seeing much more consumer awareness around sort of the origin of things. They're really asking more questions like we used to do with food, which is what we need to do now with fashion.
Nice. And last but not least, Ursula.
I'm Ursula de Castro, and I am the Global Creative Director and co-founder at Fashion Revolution. For everything else, I have a bit of an identity crisis as to what I am. I'm a recovering fashion designer. I am a curator, a promoter, and a mentor for young, sustainable designers. And somebody recently described me as an agitator in chief and a fashion thinker. So make what you want of it with this funny journey. But I am very committed to making this industry better, and above all, very committed to discuss today what luxury really is and what refusal really means for me.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Ursula. I'd like to keep this a very fluid conversation. So I do have some questions that I've basically created for you individually, but I'd like you to, feed in or jump in any time that you feel you'd like to share. We'd like to first start with Michael. Michael, you said you've been at KERING for some time, and based on what I've seen and read from you, you've done a great deal based on your environmental, as far as reducing the environmental footprint or the carbon footprint of the brands at KERING. But I'm wondering, since suppliers play such a key role in KERING's success, would it not be more advantageous to make these suppliers true partners of KERING? And by true partners, I'm speaking about, sharing things like gross profit margins and, basically equipping these suppliers or value chain clients to create wealth for the first time and maybe even innovate for themselves and provide solutions back to KERING. Is that something that's on the radar for KERING? And if so, can you give us a hint of what that is? And if not, can you tell us why not?
Well, I think it's important to understand our supply chain is a little different from the typical. When we talk about the fashion industry, there's mass fashion, there's different kind of segments and different kind of supply chains that are associated with it. Our supply chain is actually based on a lot of family-owned businesses that are, you call them SMEs, or they're small enterprises. The average size is under 50 people. And we have literally thousands, probably between around 4,500 of those suppliers, maybe off a few hundred, but 4,500 of those suppliers in our supply chain. So in a way, it is kind of a collective in that, we work with suppliers, and they're based in communities. A lot of those suppliers are based in northern Italy. So there is a very close economic tie between our brands and those suppliers. And it's been a long-standing one, too. It's not just, something recent. So I think in that way, it is a bit of, there is a definite interconnection that I would say that already exists there. And I think, you really, if you look at how fashion works, and there's innovation in terms of new materials and new ideas, and a lot of that does actually come from those partners, those workshops, that because they have here's a new fabric, they're proposing new ideas all the time. I think from the environmental footprint side, where we see, and this is where what we measured our environmental footprint, looking all the way back to the raw materials. And when we say raw materials in fashion, when you mean a raw material, you mean a fabric. This is in the sense of raw material like a farm, and or cotton or sheep or whatever it is. And looking at that footprint, for us, the biggest challenge we had to tackle in terms of reducing our footprint, almost 68% of our footprint is actually in that raw material production. So it wasn't at the ateliers, which, is kind of what we always thought about. When we thought about our universe, you think about your direct suppliers and you think about your customers. But we started thinking back, okay, where is this stuff coming from? And how can we impact those supply chains? And those are the supply chains, for us at least, because when we're talking about Italy, we're talking about factories that are small. I've been in those factories. The working conditions, the ones that I've seen, have generally been pretty nice. In some ways, more fun than the office environment that I work in. I mean, it's dynamic, but it's not the same as if you go to Bangladesh or something like that. But the challenge is when you start tracing back in the supply chain and you start looking at, things like where's cotton from, leather, although a lot of our leather is from Europe, not all of it is, and understanding those supply chains and how those supply chains interact with the community, what the factors are around that drives those, and how you can change that. I mean, there's both the social element and the environmental, because you'll hear statistics of fashion's impact, but fashion does have a big impact, and trying to kind of shift that curve is a big part. I mean, then there's other stuff we can talk about, consumption, which kind of gets back to our tagline for today. There's lots of different elements that come at play, but for us, it's really been a bit of a different focus, which is going beyond and working with those partners, but trying to figure out, okay, how can we source better? Like, how can we do this stuff in a better way?
Okay, Michael, thank you for that. I think just to get us back on the question and a bit more on the, on the point of the question, it's more about recognizing that there's an inequality gap between the supply chain and, let's say, a brand. And especially from the luxury perspective, we look to you to kind of lead by example. So when you mention like countries like Bangladesh, and I guess that's kind of been alluding to fast fashion, those brands, they emulate what the luxury brands are doing. So if you're doing it right, and you're basically narrowing the inequality gap that exists between the supply chain, whether it's in Spain, whether it's in Italy, whether it's Romania, wherever you're actually producing, the suppliers are not. I mean, there is an inequality gap that exists. I mean, I think that it's no secret. Do you have anything more concrete to say about that in direction of the inequality gap that exists between the supply chain?
Very concrete. We did a study with Camarella della Moda and the Fair Wage Network. I think it was published about 2 or 3 months ago, and it was with one of our brands in particular. Gucci was very active in that, but we had some other brands too. And actually, we looked at living wage in Italy. So, and discovered that not discovered, we already knew this, but that we looked at that topic and actually addressed actually the wages. And one of the reasons that we're trying to keep production in Italy is for that reason, because we wanted to see what are the wage scales and the collective bargaining agreements relative to a living wage. So I think the topic really, if you're talking about value, which is very great, and I love it. I used to talk about value distribution and all that for a long time. But concretely, the metric you need to use in fashion is living wage. And I think that's a key one to look at. And that's where, again, it gets back to sometimes sourcing country is important. And you look at laws and regulations and how things work. Sometimes it also depends on what kind of suppliers you're sourcing from, because there's always good and bad actors in every country. But I think a single metric, if you're going to pick a single metric around that, it should be living wage. And that's to me, the most important one to start with. Then we can get into the utopian discussion about value distribution and capitalism and all that stuff. But to me, the single metric that's the most important, and a lot of work that we've been looking at is living wage, and also connecting living wage to well-being. There's an interesting study from Novartis on that right now, talking about, that was just published with Valuing Nature and a few other folks and a few other universities participated in that connection between wage and people's quality of life and well-being. And I think that's a critical thing to look at, that's practical and on the ground. And then you can start talking about value distribution and profit sharing and all that kind of thing. But to me, that's a secondary, and to me, that's a little more of a, what kind of system do you believe in terms of business? Do you believe more in a socialist system? Do you believe more in a capitalist system? But that's a little beyond my remit. My remit is to say, look at, okay, what kind of things can we identify that we can make a difference on, and where can we make a difference? And where I've seen the biggest gap in our context is going to the raw material, because the further you get away from, let's say, the production of what you see and all that, when the further you get into the supply chain, the deeper the issues and the problems can be. And they go well beyond that, gets into not just issues of wage, but issues of personal freedom, all those different things that can come into play with raw materials, is where I think, at least for us, is where the biggest challenge lies.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I'd like to get some feedback from Ursula, the head agitator-in-chief, regarding the statements that were just made. I mean, for me, I'm listening to this, but I am also hearing a very corporate response, which is fine. That's normal. But I'm also looking for disruption always, because I feel like we cannot move forward if we're always moving in the same direction and talking about the same business as usual. For me, if we're talking about narrowing the inequality gap, we just need to do it. We just need to assist those who are intricate parts of the supply chain, and helping them to create wealth. Just because in the end, if you're talking about brands like Gucci or KERING, etc., I'm sure that they're not struggling for reaching a living wage. But what are your opinions there, Ursula?
Well, I mean, let's agitate it. Let's shake it up a little bit. I'm with you completely, Dio. I mean, for me, obviously, this is the most complicated part of the conversation, because obviously we need to ensure that supply chain workers throughout the world and throughout the supply chain have a chance to unionize. That's the most important element, in the sense that it is with that they will find the strength to demand their living wage, to be able to, create collective bargainings and so on and so forth. And we know that this is certainly not happening. We also know that the way that the fashion industry has moved from pretty much its onset has been to exploit people and to exploit natural resources. So I hear Michael, because I know that, obviously brands are made of people, and, people often are incredibly engaged in doing the right thing and ameliorating things. But obviously, the bigger the ship, the harder it's going to be to steer it. And this is what I find interesting. For me, it's this conversation around the size and the capability of the mainstream industry versus the, you know, the new players, such as someone like Emma that we will hear from in a little bit, and the designers that I have the honor and the pleasure to mentor and work with. For me, the point with luxury is that I refuse to accept it. I refuse the name luxury unless it is 100% traceable. So that is my main point when it comes to my own judgment, my own value judgment. I want to know every step of the way from the raw material to every hand that made it. And I also want to imagine an industry that affords, as you say, luxury to the people that make those luxury products. So the more a product is luxurious, the more I and many more customers want to know that it is affording a very dignified life to those highly skilled individuals that are producing it. I come from Venice originally, and in Venice, one of the images that stuck with me was seeing the people selling fake luxury in front of the luxury stores. And, you know, I looked at that product, which is often, we know, coming from, you know, subcontracting or from the factories themselves that are producing luxury in excess. And I wonder what's the difference. You know, we know that a fake product is potentially, you know, feeding a, exploitative supply chain, but do we have the pedigree, the impeccable 100% pedigree from the luxury brand that's standing behind the fake, you know, luxury being sold of that? And, you know, pedigree, luxury, it's all down to that, you know, that intrinsic total traceability of, you know, from the very origin. And for me, that needs to be visible, that needs to be disclosed so that customers can make up their mind. What's luxury to you? For me, something that doesn't have a human handprint, that doesn't have a human mistake, that doesn't have that guarantee that every single step of the way, this luxury product, it's doing its best to really be luxurious. Luxurious for the planet, luxurious for the resources, and luxurious for everyone that has made it, then I refuse to accept it as luxury.
Oh, that's quite insightful. Thank you very much for that, Agitator-in-Chief. I couldn't agree more. Let's actually bring Emma into the conversation. I'm sorry to be ignoring you. Actually, I'm quite inspired by the work that you've been doing as such a young designer. But I do have some questions as it relates to your goals and some of the things that you're involved in at the moment. And I just wanted to know, does your desire to create in a rural and agricultural area limit your ability to create in any way so far?
I would say it can be seen as a limit, but for me it's quite the opposite. Like it's a driving force, a source of an infinite creation. And I like to work with artisans, with the agriculture, with nature, so it will be more in a urban environment. So my creation will be limited. Yeah.
And can you tell me if you've been inspired by any of this disruptive activities with regards to bioplastics, biomimicry, lab-grown cottons? Are any of those things enticing to you at all? I know that you're very focused on, you know, utilizing things that are close at hand to you, but are any of these new innovations inspiring to you?
Yeah, actually for a long time I was fascinated by the idea of finding a new material, something will revolution the textile industry, like biotechnology, or for example, I work a lot, I experiment a lot with Susan Lee kombucha leather recipe.
Okay.
But at the same time, I also realized that there are already a lot of incredible material that I've made their proof since millennia, and they kind of disappear today. And then, so I try to focus more my work on rehabilitating and bringing back to life this know-how, which makes the beauty of, and the richness of our regions. And finally, I work a lot with museums to find the tools, to find people who still know the gesture. And for example, I did this kind of work for rice straw. And what I like the most is work with living things. So whether it's growing leather with bacteria or growing straw, for me it's the same pleasure and the same experimentation.
Oh, so you're actively involved in that already, which is very amazing. I mean, can you tell me a bit more about your? I saw noted that you're very interested in having your own farm and using, you know, the yield from your own farm to create your own garments. Are you already on that track, or is this something that's more aspirational?
Yeah, I started concretely like recently. I started to plant some rye in the fall to be able to produce my own straw with the help of my farming family. And this is the first plantation, so I think I will doing several tests to see when is the best time to harvest the straw and why rye is hardly cultivated for the straw. So there is not so much information, and I think it's a first step. And I wish I could cultivate other materials in the future, but I have to start with something. And
Nice.
I like sorry. I like to take time to do things well, and for me, it's completely into a circular fashion, like to create the plant from the plant to the garment. Also from the also the consuming and selling, and make last the clothes as long as possible. It's like an holistic question.
That's amazing. And can you tell me your you know, are you embracing circularity at all? And when I say circularity, I know you've mentioned that you're conscious of it, but are you actually implementing circular practices as a young designer already?
Yeah, I think it's a little scale for now, and I want to stay little also. And yeah, circularity is a vast question, but I think I try to make every step circular and logical. But yeah, it's hard to make everything. I think I still make some mistakes, and but it's okay. I'm learning. We all learning.
Yeah. Amazing. I'm very inspired by
conversation. I'm going to say
yes,
I have the
in.
pleasure to jump in. I have the pleasure to mentor Emma as part of the Mercedes-Benz HYÈRES activation. And my colleague Tamzin Blanchard, who is the brilliant Fashion Open Studio curator, and I were blown over. And, you know, for me, there is something around what Emma is doing and a whole generation of designers that are looking into the concept of fiber shed, you know, what Emma was saying, from farm to garment. Right. I mean, that to me is absolutely the height of innovation. Yeah. We've seen it in food. We're beginning to see it in some amazing beauty brands as well, really looking after that, you know, original ingredient. But in fashion is, you know, you don't think, oh, let me just grow my own cotton and make my shirt from it. And yet, you know, at the end of the day, if we are going to work in tune with nature rather than against it, this is the technology. This is the future. This is where we're going towards. And it's so much more exciting than an app or a, you know, or I don't know, all these things Granny doesn't understand. But
Right.
this is this true, intimate, poetic technology that we're moving towards, which defies scale. But as Helen Crowley from KERING taught me in one of her talks, it may defy scale, but it allows replication, which is healthier, more just, and infinitely more, I feel right for a world of so many billions of people. How can we scale one to exploit
Without
millions?
the
Wouldn't it be better to just, replicate hundreds of thousands to give
flip the
support to
script,
the communities?
to flip the
Michael,
script
please
on
jump
this,
in.
and I'm speaking more just from my own person. If you imagine fashion was like food, imagine if all we had in the world was chain restaurants. And that's kind of what I think, and I obviously I wasn't alive 150 or 200 years ago, but if you went to Scotland, there might be a farm, next to the farm, someone, maybe spinning the wool. Actually that was a lot of, even in the U.S. where I grew up, there was mill towns, there was a long history of sort of local production, and people would specialize and be very good at it. And that's what they were known for. And if you think of food in that, well, I think of food in two ways. One, a restaurant, that's part of what you get, local cuisine. Ideally, it's being locally grown too. But what's happened in fashion, because of vast population growth, because of industrialization, because of all the forces of an economic sector that rewards growth and rewards profitability, of course, we've found ourselves in this situation. And it may make sense for some things like automotive, and that's where I started. Automotive, it takes it takes a lot of capital to make a car. I mean, it's not easy. It's not like you can't just go stitch it together, literally. There's a lot of, and it's, safety and all that stuff. But even automotive, Tesla kind of flipped the switch. Because I'll be honest, and I was in California then, when I first heard about Tesla, I was thinking, like, cars are complicated. There's all these safety stuff. You have to store parts for 10 years. If something goes wrong, and there's some issues with Tesla. They're not perfect, but they created a whole new concept in a sector that really, to me, was one of the most difficult. Probably the most difficult is aviation, and even the biggest aviation companies can't always get it right too, as we've seen recently. But it's interesting because, fashion, to me at least, started as something that was very local, just like food has. And then it kind of went through all these stages to where now, you go almost anywhere in the world, and it's a little bit of monoculture. So that's one of the challenges we have in the fashion world today. It's not just a fashion challenge; it's a life challenge. It's a cultural challenge. It's the plus side of gold. There are some positives of globalization, because also sometimes you can have the dark side of local and nationalism and all that stuff, which we see today and all. But it's kind of taking the best, and the best of, to me, the best of local is, let's show what can be done with a design using traditional fabrics, using from traditional farming, from a whole line of thinking that's idiosyncratic to that particular area, and even in the designer thinking, taking all that into account. It's really interesting to me. That's much more interesting than this kind of mass design, which will be replaced by artificial intelligence, which will you can go on and on. So to me, it's very interesting. And also, many years ago, I worked for a company called Autodesk, and Autodesk was interesting because they created a program called AutoCAD. And before then, if you were an industrial designer, like, you had to buy these really big, expensive systems. But AutoCAD, I mean, it's not, I won't say it's relatively inexpensive. And they used to say what it did is it democratized design, because anyone could design with it. And I thought that was really cool, because it put like power into people to, create anything, and if you want to create the next cool candle holder, or the next cool, like, you want to reinvent the fork, you could do it in that. You could create a building, you could create anything in there. And I thought that's really interesting, is how, maybe back to what you were saying, but saying it a little different way, is how do you democratize fashion? How do you democratize it? Because it's not a democratic system right now, not really. How do you democratize it? How do you make it that people can play in it at various levels? And unfortunately, fashion, and I speak of all fashion, fashion has become sort of one of those areas of industrialization, of globalization, which came from colonialization, where you had raw materials from, countries far, far away that were exported and then finished in European, or in the US. We had a different version of that in the northern states. But there's a whole history behind it that was a history. You can read things of 150 years ago that were factory stories that were the same in the US, in fact, in New York City, that are very similar to stories you'll read today in Bangladesh or other parts of the world. So there is this legacy of fashion. There's a business model, and there's sort of a way of thinking that's a very linear. So when Emma talks about the circularity, and it is really disruptive, because it's going back to what it was before industrialization. Because the industrialization and globalization is what replaced that. And it's not just on that, it's on food too, it's on agriculture. When industrial agriculture is extremely destructive. It's destructive to the soil, it's destructive to the environment, it's destructive to biodiversity, because it's taking massive amounts of land. So we have this kind of myth around industrialization. And what's interesting is the disruption. And there's a economist called Schumpeter that years ago wrote about the disruption actually comes from new entrants. It never comes from people that are in the industry, because they all have the same mindset, and they've been successful with a business model. That's why Tesla wasn't automotive people. Not really a lot. In fact, I knew some of the people that went there. They're people from software, from tech, different. So you have to bring in different thinking, and you have to disrupt in actually starting with small disruptive things, like what Emma's doing.
Yeah. So back to what you were saying regarding disruption and disrupting from a smaller scale, and obviously looking at circularity. What is KERING currently doing to embrace circularity?
That's a very corporate
and disrupting.
Question.
Is it? Is it?
No, I think no, seriously, we're looking at, like I said, the chain that we're really trying to disrupt is raw material creation, like things like regenerative, like one of my colleagues, Helen Crawley, who Ursula mentioned earlier. We're really looking at regenerative agriculture, because that's a driver of biodiversity, that's a driver of carbon footprint. There's some estimates that the fashion industry generates 10% of the world's carbon, but a lot of that, what we've seen, it comes from the actual creation of the raw materials. So obviously looking for innovative raw materials is part of it, but yet those raw materials have not yet become, I'll say, turned the corner on being able to scale with them, and they have the length of use. I mean, part of the problem we have, and this is a story I love to tell, but I sat at a panel at Premier Vision next to a gentleman he was a designer from another luxury group, and he used to be a buyer, which is very unusual to have a buyer transition into being a designer. And I wish I knew his name, but I'm really bad with names. And he was but he did menswear, might have been Dior, I'm not sure. And he was saying, I want to tell you about this material. This material, I discovered, it can hold 6 times its weight in water. It can regulate temperature. You can get it in any kind of finish or color that you like. It's really an amazing material. Do you know what it's called? Everyone's like, what? He said, wool. And part of the problem is some of our natural materials are really, really amazing materials. Leather is an amazing material. You can talk about the ethics and the meat and but as a material, it's very durable, and it's very durable, and you can make different colors and different finishes. And so one of our challenges in the industry, and it's funny, I talked to someone the other day who was talking to me about mushroom leather. He said, you know what? I'm not going to call it mushroom leather because it shouldn't be trying to replace leather. Actually, that company also had tanneries and other things. So there's a reason he was saying that. He's saying what we need to introduce, but he's right about this. We need to introduce it as a new kind of material. Not to say it's leather, it's something different. And so part of the challenge is coming up with these new things, but they really are sustainable. Not just like because remember, a new material that was made very popular probably about 70 years ago was plastic. It was amazing. It seemed unlimited. You had all this petroleum. There was no end in sight for plastic. So you can have the law of unintended consequences. And so I think, one of the things when we look at new materials, we got to look at the impact. We got to look at the full circularity of it. One of the things we started measuring now is the end of life, which kind of to make our stuff circular, is we've always measured from, we call it from cradle to grave. But now we're measuring, okay, well, what actually, I'm sorry, we did cradle to gate, which is what was the impact of making the clothes, the boots, whatever, the purse. What is the impact of making it once you give it to the customer? But now what we're looking at, okay, how is the customer using it? Is it recycled? Is it this? Is it that? What's the end of life? Can it be transformed back into a new product? And actually measuring that footprint all the way, and then finding the things that actually reduce that footprint, either at one end or the other, or both, is going to be the key, and then scaling them. So where we started with regenerative agriculture.
Right. So in the end, the question about circularity, I'm not really hearing a response. It says that you're really doing something towards circularity, but I'm going to move on. And I got a question
I made the response, but I'm not sure you were listening to the response.
Understand it. No, maybe I don't understand. I'm basically looking to understand what current activity that KERING is engaged in that is embracing circularity.
If you want me to tick off projects in terms of regenerative agriculture in New Zealand, CQ wool, I can tick off things, cashmere in Mongolia. I can do like a laundry list of projects that we're doing.
So at the end of the day, circularity from
South Africa on lamb. There's a lot of different, but they're at agricultural level. They're agricultural projects that look at create a regenerative circularity within agriculture is really important.
Right. Obviously not from a product perspective. So from, as you said, cradle to gate, you're not looking from the design element first and raw materials, production, etc. You're not looking at circularity from that perspective. You're looking more from an agriculture perspective, correct?
We're looking at providing the most sustainable raw materials to our designers and creators possible. That's where we feed it. So what we've done to make this clear, and I think this is important because it's easy to skip over and oversimplify, is re-engineered our supply chain by looking at where the highest impact raw materials are and transforming the production of those raw materials. That's step one. Step two is then looking at materials new innovative materials that can potentially replace those. But there's a huge difference when you look at, for instance, leather and agricultural systems around leather. Again, you'll have like 10 to 12% of carbon in the soil that's released in unsustainable agricultural systems. That's climate change. It's not a joke. It's a very serious matter, and fashion is a very big part of that, even though we have a part of with the leather and sheep and whatever. But how you do agriculture on the ground can have a huge impact in terms of the entire footprint of a product. And as I said, the science told us the biggest impact is actually in the creation of those raw materials. Then you got to follow through, and of course, there's things you can do with heavy metal-free tanning. You can do things with water-free dyeing, and there's all kinds of other CO2 dyeing. There's lots of technologies, and we work with incubators like Plug and Play and Fashion for Good, and we're doing all that too. But where I'm saying is the most tangible bang for the buck right now, if you really want to make a difference, is the agricultural systems that we have today. There's something like 40 harvests left on the planet if you keep the same agriculture as we have today. 40 harvests. We need to make a big shift, and fashion is part of that shift.
Emma, sorry, you wanted to interject?
Yeah, I agree that that agriculture is one of the key, but I think like the two key of sustainability are nature and humans. And even if humans is not quantifiable with footprints and everything, I think we don't have also to forget it, because it's more like ethics. And yeah, as you made the comparison with the food industry, I would say that maybe we don't need new ingredients. Like we just have to see what we have and do it better, I think.
Thank you, Emma. Ursula,
agree.
before we
Yeah.
lose time, I want to discuss, I want to talk to you a bit. I know you have a new book coming out through Penguin Life, Love Clothes Last. Can you give us a bit of an insight to what motivated you to write this book? Oh, there it is. There it is. And when is it available?
It's yeah. Well, I'm on my desk, so. And I wasn't motivated to write a book. I was picked up on Instagram, rather like Kate Moss was discovered on an airport from her agent. So somebody
Beautiful.
wrote to me saying, would you like to write a book on mending? And I said, I can't mend. I'm really bad at mending. And I don't really think that I can do a how to mend, but I can certainly do a why to mend. And the thing for me is that it is just as important that we learn to, repair our clothes, but there's going to have to be a lot of repairing of broken systems to do in the future. And I pick a little bit back on what, Michael was saying around agriculture, and we're going to have to give back land to the earth, and we're going to have to give back land to the people from whom we've stolen it. And, this is also repairing. So my book is about repairing. So I go from my own wardrobe, because I believe that the second somebody buys something, they enter the value chain and the supply chain. The supply chain is not some faraway land. It's every morning when you get dressed, you're in it. So you have a huge responsibility to make it better from your moment onwards. And so I talk a lot about quality, and I don't think it's rhetorical, but I do look at certain pockets in the past where I feel that we provided a dignified industry and created beautiful and dignified products that last forever. And then I'm afraid, for me, there is a period within this kind of globalization when it really does become a joke, whether it's fast fashion or fast luxury. We totally enter this unimaginative, destructive, and utterly dangerous industry. I bring denim as an example, pre-distressed denim as an example. But unfortunately, I don't want to be rude here, but I also bring in my grandmother's Gucci bags as an example of how things were made and what they looked like when they were made with that dignity that I'm talking about, that we need to find again. I don't know whether we've lost it, but we certainly need to find it. So that, in a nutshell, is the book. But, the book is influenced by my relationship with Fashion Revolution, my team, and all of the global teams that we work so closely with, as close as possible with. And the truth is that Fashion Revolution believes that we need to we need to see a fashion industry that restores the environment, that conserves the environment, and certainly that values people and planet above profit and growth. And I think we need to be very careful with the language. So I try to be eloquent and articulate with my language. But, growth is not the same as abundance. And richness is not the same as prosperity. And those are the distinctions that we need to make. That's the conversations that we need to hear from those brands. Not this generalization of, as I said, the bigger the ship, the harder it is to steer it. But I would like to see abundance. And abundance means that Emma will sell lots in order to be able to feed her farm. And Emma's peers will be on our high street next to H&M and Zara and Gucci and Michael Kors. And I want to talk about, you know, the concept of prosperity being equally distributed or more equally distributed along the supply chain, because we've got to give back to those people from whom we've taken mercilessly away. And yet they really are, you know, our future. And so that's what I try and explain in the book. I'm also trying to get the book as read as much as possible. It's a cheap paperback. We didn't do a coffee book. We did something which hopefully will be readable and available and accessible. And I have to say, in that, the disaster that has been COVID has helped me enormously, because COVID to me has acted like a magnifying lens on everything that we've done wrong. And we are called fashion revolution, but sometimes I feel, yeah, you know, the revolution, the disruption. But I want to look at the word revolution also in another way. I mean, that is the letter R before the word evolution. We need to evolve as people. And I wrote recently on a blog, you know, the one technology we've not tried is to treat each other as equals. Until we do that, no technology will save us. No circularity will work. No fashion will ever be beautiful enough. So these are big changes. And as Michael said, they're not quite my remit, thank God. But it is my remit to talk about it. And it is my remit to talk about it with younger designers who are getting into the industry now and who have a different feeling from the CEOs that got into power yesterday. So hopefully, you know, the book will touch and create
when can
some
we
changes.
expect this? When can we expect the
Dio,
book?
first of all, thank you so much for taking time in your summer to quote. But yeah, it's coming out in England on the 11th of February, in Italy in March,
Beautiful.
And then in France, but I forgot the date.
Okay. Well, I have a few questions. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Ursula. I have a few questions that I would like to get to, and then maybe we can go back to talking about some other topics if we have time. But this is actually a question for you, Michael. What are the main ways in which Kering is showing leadership for designers like Emma right now? In the real tangible terms, or in small designers who are setting the agenda in terms of sustainability and equality? Is small the only way forward because big brands
I didn't hear the whole question.
No, I was wondering, is it me or have we lost Dio?
I was wondering the same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
I think I know what the question was, and I'll try to answer it as best I can. I mean, there's a lot of things we do with young designers in terms of like London College of Fashion, with Tsinghua University, with we did stuff in the past with Parsons, with now with Institut de la Fashion de la Mode. I probably just said that wrong. And so clearly, like creating, I'll say, pipeline of opportunity for young designers is key for the industry, key for creativity. It's a differentiation of what makes, I don't know, what makes something not just, you know, I use a probably bad example, but, you know, in 80 years ago in China when everyone wore the same thing. So, you know, obviously differentiation makes a big difference. And interestingly, you see China, and today people really want to express their individuality. So I think, you know, that pipeline is really important. I think where it's interesting what you're saying, you know, and also we're working with some fashion incubators now as well. So that's interesting as well. So I think that's one aspect. I think, you know, it's a real question what I was going to back to before about democratization, because I think there is an opportunity to rethink the industry and rethink it in terms of, you know, how do you harness all this creative energy? Because when you have big designers have design teams behind them, which is a lot of these actually creative talents that are coming out of these schools. But maybe there's a different way to distribute that creativity too. Back to the original question about distribution of value, maybe also distribution of creativity. So I think what would be really interesting is if you can have a way of democratizing that creativity, where designers can, because the biggest thing for a new designer is, okay, you may have a lot of ideas, but how can you, first of all, how do you get the stuff made? That's not easy. And if you want to do it sustainably, that's even harder. How do you find sustainable materials, sustainable manufacturing? It's quite difficult. So, I mean, that's definitely an area that we've been looking at. We're working with a few La Caserne, for instance, in Paris is another initiative like that that's creating incubator for fashion brands, so for emerging fashion brands and new fashion brands. So I think kind of that may be really the future. To me, the innovation of the new materials is really interesting, but the innovations in terms of creating environments for designers where they can actually put their designs into reality and make them commerciable is sort of the next wave. And that's where
Michael, can I ask you a question? I don't know if can I ask you a question? I don't know if Dio is back. But so one of the things that I've noticed while, you know, in my career is the tendency from big fashion houses to somehow inglobate, to buy, you know, to bring in these designers and call them their own. Have you ever thought about an alternative? Why, instead of buying a brand, wouldn't you rent it? I mean, my feeling is that I have a problem with scale. I have a problem with your size. I don't like necessarily this endless growth, which goes at the end of the day to the top of a pyramid. I feel that growth ought to be, as I mentioned before, redistributed immediately. And I was looking at the fate of people such as Christopher Kane, for instance, who kind of came into KERING, was bought, was given a shop, and then, you know, God knows what happened. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you've got stores, you've got supply chains, you've got manufacturers, you've got everything you need. Why not rent a group of designers and incubate them that way, give them that visibility, give them the space for a period of years, and then just let them be? No profit to you, just to them.
That's a fun idea. I mean, obviously, I mean,
Thank you, Ursula.
I'm not in a role, again, that's like way beyond my remit.
No, I know.
But I think that's a really interesting idea.
I was just making up for Dio being gone.
No, I mean, it's like, if you look at, you know, I think, and it didn't really work out that way. It's funny, but, you know, a ways back when platforms were created, like Android and the Apple Store and all that, in the beginning, that's what they were like. You could like create an app and you had this platform to distribute it, and, you know, it's a simpler model. But that's kind of the idea. No, I mean, I like the idea. I love the idea, actually. Now, I don't know, I'm not in a position to make that happen. It's creative.
Why don't we make that happen? You know, just don't buy them, don't inglobate them, rent them, incubate them, give them all the visibility. Everything you've got is theirs to use, to learn from. But then they're free.
And I think it's interesting, and this gets back to the beginning of the discussion, which is it's a little different kind of model. And it'd be very interesting, you know, as I said, I would love to see something like that created. I really would, because I think that's a very interesting kind of model. It's a different model than today's, well, let's make it happen. Let's go raise some money. No, sometimes it's harder than one thing. But no, but I actually think, I mean, I'm intrigued by that kind of thing, because I think there's a big opportunity in the industry for something like I said, democratizing, whether it's, you know, and, you know, I thought of this, you know, like now you have local manufacturing, and this is a little different than doing your own farming. But, you know, if you have a knitting machine that can be a 3D knitting machine that can make a sweater and whatever, why can't I, you know, take a design that, you know, my cousin had and go in and say, you know, make me this sweater. And now I was going to say, and then talk about it on social media, but social media, I think, is a really double-edged sword, because the level of conversation and lack of sophistication in social media, I think, can also be a bit disheartening sometimes, because it doesn't elevate to the level of some of the topics we're dealing with are complex topics. It's changing economic systems. It's changing. It is. It's changing. Power bases.
Good.
I mean, it's easy for us to get on here and talk about it, but it's like really effing hard to implement these things, even at a small scale. And sometimes they can go in directions that you never anticipate. But the point is, I think these ideas are like, this is the future of the industry. I hope it's ideas like that.
Yeah, I can tell you just to reiterate to what you were saying. I'm not sure you're aware of what we do at the Bear Scouts, but in fact, we actually bring brands and the supply chain together, and we do offer the things that I've actually asked if KERING could offer, which is narrowing the inequality gap, sharing profit margins with the supply chain, basically creating wealth. So it's not really that hard to just talk about it because we actually do it in practice. Nevertheless, I appreciate you having the patience with me and letting me rib you a bit. We do have one more question, and I believe it's actually towards you, Michael. The question is from Anna, and she asks, will new materials help reduce the footprint of fashion if people are not made aware of their overconsumption?
No. Because, it depends. Yes, they will to some degree, but the biggest problem is consumption. So let's say if you take the number that, there's 2 garments made for every garment sold. I don't know what the science, but let's just assume for right now that's the right answer. The biggest savings you can have and is not overproducing. Because if you're producing 2 for every 1 sold, obviously you can cut your footprint by 50%. Now, part of the problem in fashion is fashion creates demand, and it's a little hard to sometimes predict the demand. So there's some issues around that, and timing of supply chains. And for instance, even if you have a local designer that you hook up with the supply chain, and let's say the lead time is 6 to 8 weeks, and it's really hot in the beginning, and you're selling all these shirts or whatever, and you're getting bigger production orders, and then all of a sudden, somebody else comes out with another shirt or something else. And for whatever reason, it's not hot anymore, which is a problem in fashion. It's hot, and then it's not. And then you had all that production is moving through that supply chain. If you cancel the orders, let's go back to social aspect, you're putting people out of work. People are going to... So
there's lots of ways. Sorry to cut you off. Because we're running out of time, unfortunately, but there's lots of ways to handle things like this. There's pre-orders, there's lots of ways around a problem. We're, as I think Ursula eloquently said, fashion revolution, if you take the R away from the evolution, we are all ever-evolving human beings, and we always come up with a way if there's a will. And I think what we're looking for from, let's say, a KERING, and again, allowing me to pick on you at the end, we're looking for leadership. We're looking for a luxury brand, like Coco Chanel said. We're looking for someone to stand up for the right thing and lead by example. I'm hoping
on a positive feed with that.
Please,
I'd love to hear more about what you do. I think that's very cool. And remember, because we're also change agents. When you're in sustainability, you're a change agent within your business too. So, right. But what I can say about KERING and what I can say about our CEO is we are open. We're not like you may think from the outside, okay, they're caught up in this world, they're going we're actually open to really transforming the model, because we know the model is not sustainable in the sense of, maybe as a business, it could be sustainable, but from an environmental and particularly an environmental, but also from a social standpoint, but from an environmental standpoint, we know we can't sustain this. The level of consumption of fashion and the footprint of fashion is not sustainable. So we need to change the paradigm. That's why the fashion pact was created. That knowledge is there, but what we need is the tools, and we need the action to make those things happen. So
Michael,
I'm definitely open to hear.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate your time. And again, I appreciate you allowing me to rib you a bit. Emma, I'm really super excited about seeing what you're going to come up with in the future. I'm really happy about the things that you're doing, and you're inspiring a generation of your peers. And Ursula, of course, I'm a huge fan. I'm very excited to read the actual copy of the book, the physical. And I suggest you all to pick up the book yourselves. And thank you for your time. Thank you for dealing with the technical issues. But stay safe and look after each other. We made it, guys. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Cheers,
Thank
all.
you all. And thank you, team Fashion Open Studio.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Tamsin. Thank you, Filippo. Thank you, guys. Cheers.